The first thing I'm going to tell you, and you may be surprised at this, but you're going to have to maintain a US-based mailing address. Yes, a real live physical mailing address. There are a lot of reasons for this. The biggest one is probably your bank and credit card company is going to require you to have a US address. You're probably going to have to maintain a US telephone number, and you're probably going to need a billing address in the US.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 239 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. This week, I'm doing a solo episode about what you need to be prepared for to be a digital nomad. I'm going to give you an overview of what it takes to go on the road and work. I'm doing this from the perspective of leaving the U.S., but much of what I'll tell you will apply if you want to be a digital nomad inside the U.S. This is a direct response to the first 42 respondents in my Career Pivot blog and Repurpose Your Career survey. I had a bunch of people ask for these types of topics. I want and need your input. I created a survey that covers both the blog and this podcast. Please take a moment to stop now and go to careerpivot.com/survey2021. There'll be a link in the show notes in your podcast player and on the Career Pivot website. I want to know what types of episodes you have liked, what you'd like to have more of, and I very much need your input on the show notes. Like, do you even read them? Most of the respondents have come in response to the Career Pivot Insights email. However, if you are listening to this right now, I want you to stop, hit the pause button, and take the survey right now. I would be most appreciative. I'll be keeping the survey open through the end of September of 2021. Now, what it takes to be a digital nomad. So welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast. I'm going to be discussing what it takes to become a digital nomad. Now, so let me first set the stage for what is a digital nomad. This is working remotely, primarily for yourself, for customers, consulting, doing projects for people, where you can be literally anywhere. Now, I'm going to make the assumption this is not in the U.S. and you are working for clientele in the U.S. or Canada or somewhere. What I'm going to tell you is if you want to do this in the U.S., most of the same things I'm going to tell you are going to apply. So let's leave it at that. Let's leave it at that with that assumption. If you are going to be working for an employer and you're going overseas, your employer's probably going to take care of everything. For years, I've had people say, well, I want to go to Mexico or I want to go to Europe and I want to go work for a foreign company and I want them to hire me. And the answer is most of them will not. They don't want you as an American working there. They want to give the work to local citizens. So let's, again, go with that assumption. The first thing I'm going to tell you, and you may be surprised at this, but you're going to have to maintain a US-based mailing address. Yes, a real live physical mailing address. There are a lot of reasons for this. The biggest one is probably your bank and credit card company is going to require you to have a US address. You're probably going to have to maintain a U.S. telephone number, and you're probably going to need a billing address in the U.S. Maybe, maybe not, but nonetheless, you probably also will need to figure out how you're going to handle handling of physical mail. Yeah, we live in the 21st century, but physical snail mail still exists. And I can tell you, since I've lived in Mexico for 3 years, I've received two pieces of snail mail that were from collection agencies. Both of them were really quite small. One was for a medical bill from 2018. That was for $40 some odd that my wife spent some time in the hospital in 2018, and they mailed it to an address that we had long since left. And they finally found me through a collection agency, and I paid it, but they actually mailed me a physical piece of mail. Otherwise, I would have not have known that. The second one was actually, we were back in Austin in 2018, and we used to use Car2Go, and they went out of business, and I had $7 I owed them. So, yes, you're going to be able to have to figure out how you're going to handle that. And one of the interesting ones is, what happens when someone mails you a physical check? Yeah, by the way, both my last two stimulus checks, they mailed to me. They did not direct deposit. When I have canceled or changed my car insurance, they keep on mailing me a check. So I have to figure out how I handle that. When the first time I got a stimulus check, I simply had my friends whose home we use as our home base, I had her FedEx the check to me. The second time I waited for us to go back to Austin so I could sign it. You could also essentially authorize someone who can access your bank account and make deposits and sign your checks. So yeah, you're going to need, there are all kinds of reasons why you're going to want a physical mailing address. And if you are in the U.S. and you have gone houseless, i.e. you've gone completely mobile, one of the easy ways of doing this is to become a South Dakota resident. South Dakota makes it real easy for you to become a resident, and in that state you have all kinds of services. Down here in Mexico, people bring their cars down, and they don't want to go back to update the registration, do the annual inspections, so they register the car in South Dakota. And South Dakota basically lets you do this all remotely. So how do you acquire a mailing address when you're not there and you don't have a real mailing address? Well, what we do is we use a friend's address. She receives our mail. I get a notice from the U.S. Postal Service every day and a picture of the mail that's coming in to her house. And if I see something odd or something that I ask her to open it, and could you please take a picture and text it to me? There are a variety of services, and I'm not going to get into them, but that will essentially give you either a P.O. box or a physical street address in the city you want. You can, the South Dakota folks have lots of these services, and they will essentially, you decide what you want them to open, scan, and email you. The other choice that people use is their kids or parents or relatives and use their address, just like we use our friends back in Austin's address. You want to pick this address wisely because this is where you're technically going to become a resident. So if you pick someplace like your relatives are in New York State, you're going to be a New York State resident, which means you're going to pay New York State income tax. Versus the reason why South Dakota is so attractive, because they have no income tax. This is also where you're going to be likely to be registered to vote, although that may be different. I don't quite understand. I am still a registered voter in Travis County. That's in Travis County, Texas, which is the county where Austin resides. So there are lots of ways to skin this cat, but you're going to want a physical mailing address. The second thing I want to talk about is finances. And how are you going to handle your banking, your credit cards? If you are in the U.S., you're just going to make sure that you can access your money. Your debit cards are accessible from an ATM machine, and you're going to do things pretty much as normal. If you're overseas, it's very likely that you can just simply access your money through using your U.S.-based ATM cards and credit cards, if credit cards are accepted for paying things. But the reality is very often you'll be paying things very differently if you're going to be doing it electronically. I recommend is if you are going to have any kind of permanent base outside the U.S., you get a bank account in that country. Now, it's going to vary a lot what it's going to take to get a bank account. I know here in Mexico, in order to get a bank account, I actually have to have a permanent address. And what I do is I pay most of my bills either through my debit card, and or there are services, and I'll give you 3 of them that are commonly used for moving money around. One is remit.ly. That's remit.ly. I have not used this, but I've had other people pay other people using it. You can actually pay directly to a debit card. The other, what I do is I transfer money from my U.S. banks to my bank account here using wise.com. It used to be transferwise.com. And the other service that you may find useful is Zoom, which is XOOM, which is a division of PayPal, which also lets you transfer money across borders. One of the things that you are going to find when you are outside the U.S. is you have to worry about exchange rates. And if you just use your ATM card, your credit card, the exchange rates you're going to get are going to be pretty crappy, because you are getting a business to consumer exchange rate. If you use any of the services that I mentioned, you'll get a business to business exchange rate. And you have to experiment depending on where you are. What I had done when I first arrived in Ajijic was I went to every ATM machine, plugged my card in, withdrew 5,000 pesos or $350, and see actually how much money was actually pulled out of my credit union account, because the exchange rates, how the fees are done. The other way of doing this is Charles Schwab has an international money market account, and they'll give you decent exchange rates, but also one of the big things is they'll refund all your ATM fees. So if you're in the U.S. and you're traveling around, that may be a good use of it's something I would recommend you start paying attention to. The Charles Schwab International Money Market Account is a real good solution for people who don't have a bank account in the country where they are living, or just simply don't want to deal with all the minutia in dealing with transferring money. The other thing I want to mention is there will be times when you need to mail a physical check to someone in the U.S. Believe it or not, couple of years ago, I went to pay my property taxes in Travis County, Texas, which is where Austin is located. And I got online and it told me that my taxes were already paid. In other words, they'd already been credited by someone else. They would this was a huge mistake. And the only way I could fix it was to mail them a check after talking to one of the folks at the tax assessor's office. And my solution was I have a bill paying account at my local credit union, at my Austin credit union, that I'm able to use to mail checks. I've had a couple other occasions where I've been asked to pay someone. They could accept payment by Venmo or by check. And I'm not a big Venmo user, and I don't know if Venmo works outside the U.S. I've used it inside the U.S., but that's one of the things that you want to look into. You also might allow someone to write checks for you and have access to your bank account. Quick interruption. If you are enjoying this podcast, please rate it and review it on whatever podcast player you are using. And more importantly, would you mind telling a friend? Thanks, and back to the podcast episode. We've been talking about paying bills, receiving and accessing your money, and transferring your money. Now let's talk about technology. One of the big things that you're going to quickly discover is time zones are not what you think they are. You need to become a religious calendar freak because the time zones will drive you nuts. One of the big issues you will run into is dealing with daylight savings time. Not every, like in the U.S., not every state goes on daylight savings time. Similarly, outside the U.S., not everybody goes on daylight savings time and doesn't do it on the same time the U.S. does. So here in Mexico, one of the things is they go off, I think it's 2 weeks later in the spring and 3 weeks later in the fall. And it's in those in-between time periods that it can literally drive you nuts. The way I stay sane is I happen to use Schedule Once, and I make everyone use the scheduling link I send them to look at my calendar and book a time. This takes care of time zone differences, but more importantly, the time zones that they are on and when they go on and off daylight savings times. Now, I, for example, keep my computer always on Mexican Central Time, but I keep my scheduling software, Schedule Once, or as the equivalent of Calendarly, and there are a variety of others, always on U.S. Central Time. And just for those 5 weeks that I have to kind of mentally adjust. So that's calendaring. Okay. The second piece is you're going to maintain a US-based telephone number. Very likely over time, you may be able to get away from this, but there are lots of ways to skin this cat. If you stay in Canada, US, and Mexico, most of the US cell phone providers provide free calling from Mexico and Canada. In my case, I have AT&T, and I just simply use that. And it comes as part of my package. I also have a Mexican cell phone number. I have a separate cell phone. One of the key pieces that you need to figure out is if, for example, you lose your phone. My wife had her phone stolen. And you say, well, AT&T say, oh, they'll just send me a new phone. No. The problem you run into is going through customs. The aduana will put 100% tariff on it. And so it's not a free phone. It's whatever the cost is. And I can get a phone here much more cheaply. So it's learning how to deal with the SIMs. And in my wife's case, I had them send the SIM to my friend's house in Austin, and we then FedEx that SIM down. You'll also find electronics to be much more expensive outside the U.S., so you typically bring your electronics with you. I actually now keep an old iPhone 6S as a backup. I don't use it, and if one of my phones fails, like one time I fell on the trails and absolutely smashed a phone, all I have to do is move the SIM and I'm fine. The second option is there are a variety of landline options, essentially voice over IP. There's UMA, there's Magic Jack. There are a variety of others that you can essentially plug a phone into your internet router and make it work. There are also a variety of apps. The most common one you can imagine is Skype. You can, for a fixed amount of money, I believe it's in the $50 or $60 range, get a U.S.-based phone number and where people can call you and you can call them from within Skype. And I'll use the example with when you're an expat, one of the things that you have to worry about is how are you going to communicate with the people that you have a relationship with back in the U.S. Most people here, WhatsApp is heavily used. And of course, with WhatsApp, the app on your smartphone, they're calling your whatever country number you are, but it doesn't really, it goes through WhatsApp. Well, my wife has an 80-something-year-old mother who has a flip phone, who doesn't have a smartphone, is not going to use WhatsApp, and she will not dial 01152 in a Mexican number. So therefore, my wife will probably, as long as her parents are alive, will continue to have a U.S.-based phone number and use it. So the next thing I want you to think about is internet access. Internet access, when someone says, hey, no problem, we got high-speed internet. Don't believe them. Number one, use speedtest.net. Have them run that. It's from Ookla, if I pronounce that right, Ookla. And you're going to find that what you consider high-speed internet is not what other people consider high-speed internet, and reliability. So one of the things I do is I actually have, in the home I live in now, I have two internet services. I have now a fiber optic based service, essentially a physical connection. I also have a 4G wireless connection. I also am able to run my computer off my AT&T phone, and I can run it off my Telcel phone, which is the Mexican cell phone provider. So, Mexican cell service provider. So it's, yes, you're going to have to plan a plan A, plan B, at least possibly a plan C, and get comfortable tethering using your computer. The other thing that you're going to have to get completely comfortable with is using a VPN, or virtual private network. This is both from a privacy perspective. You're going to find accessing U.S. sites on the internet sometimes is a real pain in the ass when you're not connected to a VPN. And sometimes it's as simple as, they throw in an additional CAPTCHA. I'll use the example. If I go to nextavenue.org, they every single time throw up a CAPTCHA, make me say, look at all these pictures. Tell me which ones are boats or which ones are planes. Does it to me every single time. And it's just a pain. So if I'm going to go there, I very often, I have a little switch. I turn on the VPN. The other thing, you will find financial services that you can't access from outside the U.S. So what I do, I happen to use a VPN service called encrypt.me. And whenever I'm going to those services, I turn it on. And I set the server I'm using to be in the U.S. I happen to use Houston or Dallas because it's the closest to the border. But it's not important which ones I choose, as long as I set up the one that's doing the conversion is in the U.S. So VPNs are incredibly valuable. Last thing is, if you watch Netflix or have Amazon Prime and you want to access it from outside the U.S., you can't without a virtual private network. If you want to be able to watch the Super Bowl or most, sporting events on your, that you will stream in, you're going to need to use a virtual private network. There are copyright issues. There are all kinds of stuff that, and you're going to have to get, if you do that, and by the way, I don't watch any TV and I watch very little sports anymore. So getting used to that and getting smart. And by the way, the providers are always getting smarter and smarter, figuring out which VPN services you're using and saying, oh, you're using a VPN. You can't do that. The last thing I want to mention is cloud storage. I happen to be a big fan of Dropbox, but Google Drive, Box.com, any one of them is number one. It's for sharing, obviously, business stuff, because one of the things you're going to find is I almost never attach anything anymore. I always send a link from Dropbox. The second piece is I put all my legal documents, I scan everything, and I put it in Dropbox. Why is this important? Is particularly when you're outside the U.S. and you have, for example, we're in the process of buying a house and they say, well, we want to copy your passport. Well, my passport's locked up. I do not carry it with me, but I can quickly get into Dropbox and email them a link of an image of my passport and my wife's passport. I have images of my green card, my resident visa. I have copies of my wills, all my legal documents that I can easily access from anywhere. And figuring out how you're going to do this, this is particularly important if you're going to be a digital nomad, is what happens when you have an accident? What happens? Can people access your legal documents if you are incapacitated? Because this is really, really important, and being able to figure out how they might be able to do this and how may they have access. I happen to use LastPass, so all my passwords are stored in one place, and I have a way for my son to be able to access this in an emergency. And so these are all planning for things that when bad things happen. I mean, the class example, we get a lot of people here who just simply say, I'm using my US-based ATM card and credit card, and I'm just going to use it. I don't care about the exchange rates. I don't care about the fees. I'll be careful about, what ATM machines I'm using from what banks give me better fees and better exchange rates. And that's great until you lose your card. When you lose your card, then trying to get a replacement overseas, depending on what country you're in, that may be a total, complete pain in the butt trying to get through the customs. Here it's the aduana. So it's not just the normal day-to-day stuff. It's what happens when you screw up. You leave your card at the ATM machine. I know we've all at some point in time in our lives have done something like that. We've misplaced a card, or the key piece here is kind of walk through the scenarios of what you're going to do in case you lose something, or your phone gets smashed, or your computer breaks. What's your backup plan? Because you are now, as a digital nomad, you're pretty much dependent on your electronics, and you better have a backup plan. Hopefully this has been helpful, and we'll close out the episode with one of the last things you want to be able to figure out is, how are you going to get back to visit clients or get back to the U.S. easily and quickly with the least amount of hassle? And I'll use the example where I live. I live literally 40-minute drive from the Guadalajara airport. Guadalajara is the second largest airport in Mexico. I can go anywhere relatively inexpensively in the U.S. in a heartbeat. Pre-pandemic, in February of 2020, I was able to get my wife's a flight to Shreveport, Louisiana the next day when her father went into the ICU in Longview, Texas, far east Texas. I was able to get her a flight on United the next day, one hop through Houston. Now, this is completely different than a variety of other places. So even if you're in the U.S., start thinking about how you want to do this. When we were originally thinking of going to Ecuador, one of the challenges we were looking at Cuenca, Ecuador, which is at very high altitudes, and all of the flights from the U.S. and most parts of the world fly into Quito, and those flights all come in late at night and go out as red eyes in the morning. The connecting flights are horrible. And it's just, what it says is if I was going to go to a conference in the U.S., I'd have to allow 2 days each way. And what happens when an emergency happens? And you need to get back to the U.S., whether it's to help a child, whether it is a death in the family. How do you do that and kind of planning that out ahead of time? So with that, I'm going to close this out, and hopefully this has been useful. I hope you got value out of that. I go much deeper in all these topics in my circle or course on amava.com about becoming an expat. I also cover topics like immigration, housing, security, and other topics. I will put links to these courses in the show notes. Please take a moment and take the survey at careerpivot.com/survey2021. Again, there's a link in your podcast player. Take a moment, go to careerpivot.com, sign up for the weekly Career Pivot Insights newsletter, which is sent out every Sunday. You will get a weekly update on the podcast, white papers, and new blog posts. While there, do not forget to check out the Career Pivot community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Look for Career Pivot on Facebook and LinkedIn. You'll also find me on Twitter at Career Pivot. Thank you for listening all the way to the end to the Repurpose Your Career podcast. You will find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-239. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podbeam, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. Hope to see you next Monday for another episode of Repurpose Your Career podcast.